Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. Today, we return to the high, razor-edged slopes of the Montana Territory. When we last walked this trail together, we left Mercy standing on the porch of her fortress, wrapped in heavy wool and solitude. She was watching a lone rider disappear into the white unknown, a man who had come with the storm and left with a piece of her heart. We left her there, with a question hanging in the frozen air. You know, there is an old saying amongst the people of the plains: winter tests the roots, but spring is when the tree proves it is alive. We have seen Mercy survive the White Eater. We have seen her survive the fire and the bullets of corrupt men. But now, the silence of the snow has retreated. The Sawtooth Ridge has finally shed its white coat. The wildflowers we wondered about, the purple lupines and the Indian paintbrush, are finally painting the slopes, just as you and I hoped they would. But the true question remains: will the rider return, or was Gideon merely a ghost of the winter? A spirit sent to save her, only to vanish when the sun touches the earth. Today, we find out. Today, we see if the seeds sown in the heart of the storm will bloom into something lasting, or if they will be swept away by a violent flood of the past. So, go ahead and brew that cup of coffee. Settle into your favorite chair. This is part 2, the promise of the wild. The air on Sawtooth Ridge had changed. If you remember the biting, metallic taste of the air when we last stood here, that sharp, iron tang of the coming snow, then you would hardly recognize the world today. The White Eater has retreated, chased back into the high clouds by a sun that feels, for the first time in months, like a friend rather than an indifferent observer. The ravine, once a throat of ice that swallowed wagons whole, is now singing with the rush of meltwater. A chaotic, joyous sound of release. Mercy was no longer the figure bundled in heavy wool and suspicion, guarding a frozen perimeter. Today, the heavy coat hangs on the peg inside the door. She is out in the garden patch, wearing a simple calico dress that catches the breeze. The fabric faded but soft against skin that has finally felt the warmth of the sun. She is on her knees in the dirt, her hands those strong, capable hands that once stitched wounds and held a shotgun steady against the dark, now working the soil. It is the kind of day that makes you forget the winter. The smell of pine sap is thick and sweet, rising from the timber like incense. The bees are drunk on the new blooms, their low, thrumming buzz weaving through the silence that Mercy values so much. She is pulling weeds from around the green shoots of the early peas, her movements rhythmic. Pull, shake, toss, pull, shake, toss. It is a peace she has earned. It is a peace she has fought for. But even in the spring, even with the sun on her back, Mercy is a creature of the ridge. She possesses an instinct honed by 5 years of silence and survival. She stops. Her hands freeze mid-motion, dirt crumbling from her fingers. The bees are still buzzing. The creek is still rushing. But underneath those sounds, there is something else. A vibration in the earth. A rhythm that doesn't belong to the wild. Thud, thud, thud. It is not the erratic scrambling of a deer, nor the heavy lumbering of a bear. It is measured. It is deliberate. It is the sound of iron shoes striking the granite spine of the mountain. Hoofbeats. Mercy stands up slowly. She wipes her hands on her apron, a reflex from 1,000 chores. But her eyes are already locked on the switchback trail below. The old tension coils in her stomach, that cold warning she felt the day the storm brought the stranger. Her gaze drifts toward the fence post, where she leaned the hoe, her mind instantly calculating the distance to the shotgun inside the door. Old habits die hard. A rider on this ridge usually means only one thing: trouble. She waits. The wind shifts, blowing a lock of hair across her face. But she doesn't brush it away. She watches the empty space where the trail meets the sky. And then, he is there. A silhouette crests the ridge, cutting a sharp figure against the blinding blue of the Montana sky. Mercy's breath catches in her throat. A small, sharp sound that no one is there to hear. She doesn't reach for the hoe. She doesn't run for the gun. She simply stands there, rooted to the earth she has been tending. As the figure resolves into focus, it is him. It is Gideon. But this is not the man she pulled from the wreckage of the prison wagon. This is not the man who slumped against her, his body ravaged by fever and the lash. Shivering so violently, his handcuffs rattled against the wheel. The ghost of the winter is gone. The man riding toward her now sits tall in the saddle. His shoulders, broad as a barn door, are squared against the horizon. He is wearing a clean duster, not the tattered, blood-soaked coat she had to shear off his body. He moves with the horse, a fluid, easy rhythm that speaks of a body healed, a strength reclaimed. It is as if the winter stripped him down to the bone, and the spring has rebuilt him into something harder, yet lighter. He has shed the weight of the fugitive. He has shed the weight of the hunted. Mercy watches him come. 1,000 questions race through her mind, colliding with 1,000 fears she hadn't dared to whisper aloud in the empty cabin. Did he finish it? Is he safe? Did he come back just to say goodbye? In the past, visitors stopped at the gate. They stopped at the perimeter of her fortress, respectful of the widow's boundaries. Even Gideon, when he left, had paused at the gate to look back. But today, he does not stop. He nudges the horse forward, guiding the animal through the open gate, past the corral, past the garden where she stands. He rides all the way up to the porch steps, into the very heart of her sanctuary. He rides like a man coming home. He pulls back on the reins, and the horse comes to a halt, blowing soft clouds of breath into the crisp air. The leather of the saddle creaks a familiar, domestic sound that suddenly feels like the loudest noise in the world. For a long moment, no words are spoken. The silence between them isn't the wary, testing silence of their first meeting. It isn't the heavy, loaded silence of the siege. It is electric. It is a live wire humming with 3 months of waiting. 3 months of looking at an empty horizon and wondering if promises made in the snow can survive the thaw. Mercy walks toward him. Her boots crunch softly on the gravel. She stops at the horse's shoulder. Looking up, Gideon looks down at her. His face is tanned from the journey, the lines of pain around his eyes smoothed out by the sun, and the resolution of his duty. His dark eyes, once sharp with fever and danger, are now clear. They hold a warmth that rivals the sun on her back. He swings his leg over the saddle horn. Do you remember how he moved before? How every step was a battle against broken ribs and torn flesh? Not today. Today, he dismounts with a fluid, powerful grace. His boots hit the ground with a solid thud, kicking up a small puff of dust. He stands before her, towering and solid, a mountain of a man who has returned to the only place that offered him shelter. He takes off his hat. The gesture is simple, but it strips away the last barrier between them. Mercy looks at him, really looks at him. she sees the scars she knows are there, hidden beneath his shirt, the map of violence he carries on his skin. But she also sees the peace in his stance. She sees a man who walked into the fire and came out the other side, just to find his way back to this ridge. She realizes then that the winter didn't just break things. It cleared the ground. It made space for something new to grow. For a woman of 35, a woman who had buried a husband and learned to value her solitude like a miser values gold. Hope is a dangerous thing. Hope is a fragile seed that can be crushed by a late frost or a corrupt lawman's bullet. But standing there in the calico dress, with the smell of pine sap in the air and the man she saved standing whole before her, Mercy realized the truth. Hope wasn't dangerous. Not anymore. Looking at him, seeing the promise kept in his eyes, she realized that hope was the only thing worth breathing for. The sun began to dip toward the jagged spine of the western range, casting the world in a deep, burning amber. It was the golden hour, that fleeting, the magical breath of time, when the harsh lines of the frontier are softened, when the granite glows like ember, and the pine needles turn to spun gold. On Sawtooth Ridge, the wind had died down to a whisper, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Inside the cabin, the air was still and smelled of dried sage and anticipation. Mercy stood before the heavy cedar trunk at the foot of her bed. It was a piece of furniture that held the past quilts stitched in long winters, linens that smelled of lavender, and memories she had carefully folded away. Her hands, usually so sure and steady, when gripping a hoe or a shotgun, trembled just slightly as she lifted the heavy lid. The hinges groaned, a familiar sound in the quiet room. She reached deep, past the wool and the cotton, to the very bottom. Her fingers brushed against cool, smooth fabric, silk. She pulled it out, a dress of deep, midnight blue. It was a relic from another life. A life before the fever took Silas, before the ridge became her fortress, before her hands grew rough with the work of survival. She had put this dress away on the day of Silas's funeral, thinking that color and softness had no place in a world of gray skies and hard labor. She had thought she would never wear it again. She had thought the part of her that could wear silk had died with him. But as she held the fabric against her chest, looking into the small, clouded mirror on the wall, she didn't see a ghost. She saw a woman who had walked through the fire. She saw a woman who had learned that strength isn't just about enduring the cold. It's about daring to let the warmth back in. Slipping into the dress was a transformation. It wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol. As she fastened the buttons, she felt the heavy armor of the widow on the ridge falling away. She was unlocking the gate she had kept barred for 5 long years. She was choosing to be vulnerable again. And out here, in this country, choosing vulnerability is the bravest thing a woman can do. Outside, the world was waiting. Gideon stood on the porch. This porch, with its new planks, replacing the ones scorched by the deputies' fire, was their victory ground. It was here they had made their stand. Now, it was to be their altar. He had been down to the creek. The dust of the road was washed away. He wore a clean white shirt, the fabric stark against his sun-darkened skin. His dark hair was slicked back, still damp from the icy mountain water. He stood with his hands resting on the railing, looking out over the valley that was slowly being swallowed by the purple shadows of twilight. He looked different than the man who had ridden away 3 months ago. The hunted look in his eyes, that constant, shifting vigilance of a wolf on the run, had settled into a quiet, potent strength. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a man ready to build. When next for, in 5 and his no, he heard the door open behind him. The screen door creaked, the same door a bullet had once torn through. He turned, and, for a moment, the breath left his lungs. Mercy stepped out of the shadows and into the golden light. The blue silk shimmered like water, a stark, beautiful contrast to the rough logs of the cabin. Her hair was loose, falling around her shoulders in soft waves, no longer pulled back in the severe braid of the working woman. She looked regal. She looked soft. She looked like the spring itself. Gideon straightened, his heart hammering against his ribs, a different kind of pounding than the adrenaline of a gunfight. He walked to her, his boots heavy on the wood, and stopped just a breath away. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes, a mixture of awe, reverence, and a profound, grounding love, said everything. There was no preacher. There was no white church with a steeple to ring a bell across the valley. There was no congregation in Sunday bests to murmur their approval. Out here, the mountain is the altar. The wind, sighing through the tops of the ponderosa pines, is the witness. The setting sun is the only benediction they needed. They stood hand in hand, their palms pressing together. Her hand, calloused from the garden hoe, his hand, scarred from the reins and the revolver. It was a fitting connection, rough against rough. Strength. Recognizing strength, Gideon reached into his pocket. His movements were slow, solemn. He pulled out a small object that caught the last rays of the dying sun. It was a ring, but it wasn't a delicate band of gold from a jeweler's velvet case. It was hammered out of rough silver, likely a coin he had worked on himself during the long nights on the trail back to her. You could see the marks of the tool, the uneven edges where he had beaten the metal into submission. It wasn't perfect. It was dented. It was scarred. It was exactly like them. It was strong. He took her left hand. His grip was gentle, terrified of crushing something so precious, yet firm enough to anchor her to the earth. He looked deep into her gray eyes, eyes that had once preferred an empty horizon, but now held his reflection. His voice, when it came, was low and raspy, a sound like gravel shifting in a riverbed. But it didn't waver. I have no land to give you, Mercy, he began, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. I have no name that is safe to speak in town. I cannot promise you a life of ease, or a future without storms. He paused, lifting their joined hands, placing them over his heart so she could feel the steady, heavy beat of it. But these hands, he said, his voice thickening with emotion, and this heart, they stand between you and the dark, until my last breath. The wind seemed to hush as the words settled over them. It was a vow more powerful than any scripture recited from a book. It was a warrior's pledge. It was a promise of protection, of fidelity, of a love that would stand like a shield against the cruelty of the world. Mercy looked at the silver band sliding onto her finger. It felt cool and heavy. It felt permanent. She didn't speak a vow in return. She didn't need to. She squeezed his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, locking them together. She stepped forward, closing the small distance between them, and rested her forehead against his chest, right over the scars that she had once bandaged. In that silence, she accepted him. She accepted the danger that walked in his shadow. She accepted the past that haunted his steps, and she accepted the future they would carve out of this rock. Together, the sun finally slipped behind the peaks, and the first star appeared in the deepening indigo sky. They were married, not by the laws of men or the laws of the church, but by the law of the wild, where promises are made in blood and kept in iron. And on Sawtooth Ridge, as the night settled over their fortress, two lonely souls finally found their home. The night deepened over Sawtooth Ridge, but inside the cabin, the darkness held no teeth. For years, the nights here had been Mercy's longest battles. The silence of the high country can be a heavy thing, a weight that presses down on the roof beams, amplifying every creak of the settling timber and every howl of the wind. She had learned to fill that silence with the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the sharp, solitary click of her knitting needles. But tonight, the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was full. The heavy oak door was bolted shut, locking out the vast, indifferent world. The curtains were drawn. The only light came from the hearth, where a bed of oak coals pulsed with a deep, steady, red glow. The firelight danced across the rough log walls, softening the edges of the room, turning the familiar tools of survival, the cast-iron skillet, the drying herbs, the gun rack, into shadows that seemed to bow in reverence to the moment the storm had brought them together months ago, crashing against these walls with a fury that demanded they survive. But it was the quiet that bound them now. They stood near the hearth, the warmth of the fire seeping into the room. The blue silk dress, so recently reclaimed from the cedar chest, fell to the floor in a soft rustle, like water slipping over stone. Gideon's shirt followed, and then there was nothing between them but the air and the truth. Mercy looked at him. She had seen him like this before. Of course, during the blizzard, she had cut the frozen clothes from his body to save his life. She had been a nurse then, a mechanic fixing a broken machine. She had looked at him with the clinical, detached eye of a woman trying to keep death at bay. But tonight, she didn't look with the eyes of a nurse. She looked with the eyes of a wife. He was a landscape unto himself. He was built like a cliff face, sheer and hard, corded with muscle that testified to a life of unyielding labor. But it was the geography of his pain that drew her hand. She stepped closer. Her fingers, cool and gentle, reached out to touch his skin. She traced the jagged white line running across his collarbone. She moved to his shoulder, where the puckered, star-shaped scar of an old arrow wound. It was a violent star, a memory of a battle fought long before she knew his name. And then, her hand moved to his back. In the dim amber light, the thin, silvery tracks were still visible. The whip marks, they were old, healed over years ago. But they told a story of a time when this mountain of a man had been chained, when his strength had been used against him. They were the marks of a world that had tried to break him, to tame him, to own him. Gideon flinched, just a fraction, as her fingertips brushed these oldest wounds. It wasn't from pain. It was from the shock of being known. For so long, these scars had been his armor. They were warnings to others. Stay back. I have seen the worst of humanity. But Mercy didn't pull back. She didn't gasp in horror. She didn't look away. She traced the lines with a reverence one might show to a sacred text. She wasn't afraid of his violence. She didn't fear the things he had done to survive, or the things that had been done to him. She honored his survival. She honored the grit that had kept him standing when lesser men would have fallen. Her hand moved around to his side, to the fresh pink skin on his lower ribs, the bullet graze, the wound she had stitched and cleaned while the blizzard raged outside. It was the mark of their shared history, the physical proof that he had bled for her, and she had healed him. "You are a map of war, Gideon," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire. "And you are the peace," he rasped, his voice thick with an emotion he had no name for. He reached out then, his large, rough hands cupping her face. He looked at her not as a fortress to be breached, but as a sanctuary to be entered. The intimacy that followed was slow and deliberate. It was a reclaiming. It was a shedding of the last defenses. For two people who had spent their lives building walls, walls of timber, walls of silence, walls of suspicion, this act of opening was terrifying. And it was beautiful. They moved together in the firelight, the shadows dancing on the ceiling. It wasn't just a union of bodies. It was a weaving together of spirits. It was the comfortable, heavy silence of the winter, deepening into something profound. It was the final affirmation that they were no longer two solitary fighters standing back to back against the world. They were one. Later, the fire burned down to glowing embers, casting a deep, ruddy twilight across the room. The wind picked up outside, whistling a low, mournful tune through the eaves. But it felt distant, powerless against the warmth of the cabin. Gideon lay on his back, the quilt pulled up to his waist. His breathing was slow and deep. For 20 years, this man had slept with one eye open. He was a marshal, a hunter, a fugitive. He was a man who knew that the snap of a twig could mean the difference between life and death, even in sleep. His muscles were usually coiled, ready to spring for the gun he kept within arm's reach. His dreams were usually haunted by the faces of men he had tracked and the cold iron of cages. But tonight, the gun was on the table, out of reach. Tonight, his hands were open, palms up, relaxed. Mercy propped herself up on one elbow and watched him. She saw the tension that had defined his face for so long finally dissolve. The furrow between his brows smoothed out. The hard set of his jaw softened. He didn't look like a cliff face anymore. He looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy load he had been carrying for a lifetime. He shifted in his sleep, turning instinctively toward her warmth. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for her, his arm draped over her waist, heavy and grounding, anchoring him to the bed, to the room, to her. A profound peace settled over the room. It was the peace of the thaw, absolute and undeniable. Mercy laid her head back down on the pillow, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. It was a strong heart, a survivor's heart. And now, it was hers. Outside, the mountain stood guard. Inside, in the circle of her arms, the warrior had finally laid down his sword. And for the first time, in a very long time, Gideon slept. 3 months is a long time in the high country. It is long enough for the seasons to turn the page, for the snow to retreat into the deepest crevices of the peaks, and for the world to remember what color looks like. Summer was approaching Sawtooth Ridge, not with the violent suddenness of the winter storm, but with a slow, golden confidence. The air had lost its bite. It now carried the scent of warming pine resin and the sweet, dusty smell of the sagebrush baking in the afternoon sun. The creek, which had roared with the meltwater of spring, had settled into a cheerful, steady babble, the sound of a land at peace. If you looked at the cabin now, you wouldn't see the wreckage of the siege. You wouldn't see the scorched planks on the porch where the deputies' fire had tried to eat its way inside. Those scars had been healed. New timber, bright and smelling of cedar, had replaced the old. The door that had been shattered by a boot heel was solid again, hung on hinges that Gideon had oiled until they moved as silently as a breath. The fortress had become a home. The garden, once just a patch of stubborn earth Mercy tended alone, was thriving. Rows of beans were climbing their poles, reaching for the sun with green, grasping fingers. The potatoes were mounded high. It was a testament to the partnership that had taken root here. Mercy provided the care, and Gideon provided the protection. And out by the woodpile, the very spot where they had once been pinned down by rifle fire, there was a rhythm of a different kind today. Twack! The sound echoed off the granite face of the ridge, sharp and satisfying. Thwack! Gideon was working. He had stripped off his shirt in the heat of the day, and the sun glinted off the sweat on his back. To watch him work was to see a force of nature harnessed. He was, as Mercy had noted on that first day, a mountain of a man. The muscles in his shoulders coiled and released with hydraulic power as he swung the heavy splitting maul. He didn't just chop the wood, he dismantled it. He struck with a precision that came from a lifetime of having to make every motion count. He was a machine of labor, built for hardship. He was the cliff face, sheer and hard. For years, his strength had been a weapon, used to break rocks in a prison yard or to hold the line against violent men. It was a strength born of necessity, fueled by the need to survive one more day. But today, he wasn't fighting for survival. He was building a stockpile for the winter, not because he feared the cold, but because he had a future to keep warm. Mercy stepped out onto the porch. She held a pitcher of cold water from the spring, the condensation beating on the ceramic. She paused for a moment, just watching him. She watched the way the sunlight caught the scars on his back, the silvery tracks of the whip, the jagged star on his shoulder. Once, those marks had made her weep for the pain he had endured. Now, they were just part of the man she loved. Maps of the road that had led him to her. She walked across the yard, her steps light in the grass. The shadow of the cabin stretched out toward him, a cool relief from the glare. Gideon sensed her before he saw her. He always did. He paused mid-swing, lowering the axe head to rest on the chopping block. He wiped his forearm across his brow, turning to face her. His chest heaved with the exertion, but there was a light in his dark eyes that hadn't been there 3 months ago. A lightness. He took the water she offered, drinking deeply. The cool liquid, a blessing against the heat. He lowered the pitcher, giving a nod of thanks, ready to turn back to his work. There was more wood to split. There was always more work, but Mercy didn't step back. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Staying the axe, she looked up at him, her gray eyes shining with a secret she had carried all morning. A secret that made the summer sun seem dim by comparison. You'd best save some of that strength, husband, she said. Her voice was soft, barely louder than the hum of the bees in the garden, but it carried the weight of the world. Gideon looked at her, confused. He frowned slightly, a playful question forming on his lips. He had strength to spare. He could chop this entire forest into kindling if she asked him to. But Mercy wasn't finished. She took his large, rough hand, the hand that had held a revolver. the hand that had been chained to a wagon wheel, and she moved it. She placed his palm flat against the calico of her dress, right over the curve of her stomach. "You'll need it," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to break him. "To build a cradle." The world stopped. The birds ceased their song. The wind held its breath in the pines. The axe, forgotten, slipped from Gideon's other hand and fell into the dirt with a dull thud. For a second, he didn't move. He stood frozen, his hand pressing against the warmth of her belly, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the sentence. A cradle. And then, the mountain crumbled. The man who had withstood the White Eater, who had taken a bullet to the ribs and kept fighting, who had stared down corrupt lawmen without blinking. He buckled. His knees hit the wood chips. Not in defeat, but in prayer. He wrapped his massive arms around Mercy's waist, burying his face in the folds of her dress. He pressed his ear to her stomach, listening not for danger, not for the approach of an enemy, but for the faint, impossible whisper of life. And then, the sound came, not from her, but from him. A sob. It started deep in his chest, a ragged, tearing sound that seemed to pull up years of sorrow by the roots. And then another. And another. He wept. He wept with the great, heaving sobs of a man who had spent his entire life believing he was broken. He had thought he was a thing made for violence, an instrument of death, meant to end stories, not begin them. He had believed that his blood was too tainted by war and pain to ever pass on. He had thought he was the storm, but Mercy, with her stubbornness, and her blue silk dress, and her open gait, she had proven him wrong. She had taken the wreckage of a man and loved him until he was whole. She had made him a creator, a father. He choked out, the word feeling strange and holy on his tongue. Mercy stroked his hair, her own tears falling silently onto his dark head. She held him there in the sunshine, amidst the smell of fresh-cut pine and hope. The winter had tested their roots. Yes, it had stripped them down to the bone. But here, in the golden light of the early summer, the tree hadn't just survived. It had bloomed, and as Gideon wept into the fabric of her dress, the wind picked up again, carrying the news down the canyon, whispering through the wildflowers that painted the slopes. The widow on the ridge was a widow no more, and the prisoner in the cage was finally, truly free. The trouble with happiness in the high country is that it can make you deaf. It can fill your ears with the laughter of a loved one and the babble of a creek, drowning out the snap of a twig that signals the predator's approach. They were miles from the cabin, deep in the dense timber, where the sun struggles to reach the forest floor. They were checking the trap lines, a routine chore they had done 100 times. Mercy was laughing at something Gideon had said, her voice bright and echoing in the cool air. Gideon was smiling, that rare, unguarded smile that belonged only to her. And then, the world went wrong. It didn't happen with a shout or a warning. It happened with a silence, sudden, absolute, unnatural. The jays stopped scolding. The squirrels froze against the bark. The wind died in the canopy. It was as if the forest itself had inhaled sharply and held its breath. Gideon stopped. The smile vanished from his face, replaced instantly by the hard, cold mask of the Marshal. He grabbed Mercy's arm, his grip bruising, pulling her close. His eyes scanned the tree line, dissecting the shadows. This wasn't Kincaid and his loud, arrogant deputies. This wasn't a posse of drunks looking for a reward. The men moving through the timber were different. They were shadows. They were mercenaries, anonymous, professional, and heavily armed. They wore no badges. They shouted no warnings. They were sent by powerful men in the capital who didn't want an arrest. They wanted an erasure. Mercy opened her mouth to ask what was wrong, but the answer came in a flash of sparks from the ridge above. Crack! The sound of the rifle shot was deafening in the silence. Gideon didn't think. He didn't calculate. He moved with the instinct of a wolf protecting its mate. He spun, throwing his massive body between Mercy and the tree line. Turning his back to the fire, the bullet meant for her heart found his leg instead. He grunted. A low, guttural sound of impact, and buckled as the lead tore through muscle and bone. He dragged her down with him into the cover of a fallen log, his blood already staining the pine needles. The laughter was gone. The summer sun felt suddenly cold, as Gideon pressed a hand to his wound and drew his revolver with the other. They both knew the truth. The dream is over. The hunt continues. The trail back to the fortress was cut off. The cabin, with its sturdy oak door, and the garden where they had planted their future, might as well have been on the moon. Gideon knew they couldn't stand and fight. Not in the open. Not with his leg trailing a ribbon of bright red blood across the pine needles. So, he did. The only thing a wounded animal can do. He went to ground. He led Mercy away from the light, pushing deeper into the dense, suffocating timber of the north slope. The locals call this place the Spirit Lands. It is a tangle of ancient spruce and deadfall, where the sun rarely touches the earth. A place where the wind sounds like whispering voices, and the shadows seem to move on their own. It is a place men fear. But fear was a luxury they could no longer afford. They moved as fast as Gideon's shattered leg would allow, tearing through the underbrush, breathless and desperate. But the forest, for all its depth, is not infinite. They burst through a final thicket of briars and skidded to a halt. The ground simply vanished. Before them lay a jagged scar in the earth, a deep, sheer chasm, dropping 200 feet to a river that roared like a caged beast below. The water was white with fury, smashing against rocks that looked like broken teeth. They were cornered. Behind them, the snap of dry wood echoed through the trees. The mercenaries were close. They weren't rushing anymore. They were slowing down, spreading out, confident that their prey had nowhere left to run. Gideon slumped against a boulder, his face gray with pain and blood loss. His hand shook as he cracked open the cylinder of his Colt peacemaker. He spun it. Click, click, click. There was only one brass shell left in the chamber. One bullet against an army. He snapped the cylinder shut and holstered the gun. With a grim, terrifying calm, he drew his hunting knife. The blade gleamed dully in the forest twilight, 6 inches of steel against rifles and hate. He looked at the river, then at the narrow, crumbling deer trail that wound precariously down the cliff face. It was suicide for a man with a ruined leg, but for a woman, for her, there was a chance. He turned to Mercy. His eyes were dark, filled with a desperate, crushing love. He grabbed her shoulders, his bloody hands staining the calico of her dress. He didn't speak the words, but his intent was screamed in the silence. Go. He tried to push her toward the edge. He would stay. He would use that last bullet and that knife to buy her 5 minutes. He would sell his life dearly so that she, and the life growing inside her, could slip away into the mist. But Mercy didn't move. She dug her heels into the moss. She looked at the terrifying drop, then back at the man who was trying to die for her. Her face hardened. The fear evaporated, replaced by the same steel that had made her open the door to a blizzard. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his muscle, anchoring him to her. "No," she whispered, her voice cutting through the roar of the river. "We don't do that. We live together. Or we die together." She stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, facing the dark trees. She made her choice. She would not be a widow again. If this was the end, they would meet it standing up. The mercenary captain stepped out from the line of trees. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, arrogant stride of a man who knows he has already won. He looked at the edge of the cliff, at the man holding a knife against an army, and at the woman standing defiantly beside him. He didn't offer a surrender. He didn't speak a word. He simply raised his rifle, leveling the black bore at Gideon's chest. The forest held its breath. The roar of the river below seemed to fade into a dull hum. Gideon tightened his grip on the knife, his body tensing to take the bullet, to absorb the blow so that she might live for 1 second longer. The captain's finger curled around the trigger. The metal whitened under the pressure. Twip. The sound was smaller than a whisper. But the result was violent. A feathered shaft suddenly sprouted from the captain's wrist, pinning his hand to the wooden stock of his rifle. He screamed, dropping the weapon as blood bloomed bright and sudden against his sleeve. Before the echo of his scream could die, the mist of the spirit lands shifted. It didn't drift away. It was pushed aside. They emerged from the gray vapor, not as ghosts, but as iron and flesh, warriors. They moved with a silence that unnerved the soul, stepping over dry twigs without a sound. They were painted for war, their eyes hard and unblinking. The Apache, and at their center, parting the fog like a ship cutting through the sea, rode the leader. He was an elder, his skin weathered like ancient parchment, etched with the lines of 1,000 suns. He did not ride a common Mustang. He sat astride a zebra dun, a horse with a coat like dried grass, marked with the primitive, dark stripes of the wild ancestors on its legs and spine. He looked like a spirit risen from the earth itself. The mercenaries, so confident a moment ago with their rifles and their numbers, are frozen. They looked at the arrow in their captain's wrist, then at the silent ring of warriors surrounding them. The fear that broke them wasn't the fear of death. It was the primal fear of the unknown. They dropped their guns. They broke rank. In a heartbeat, the hunters became the scattered prey, disappearing into the timber, running from the ghosts of the high country. The clearing fell silent again. The elder dismounted. He walked toward the edge of the cliff, his movements slow and fluid. He didn't look at the knife in Gideon's hand. He didn't look at Mercy. He stopped 3 paces from Gideon. The old man was shirtless, indifferent to the mountain chill. And there, in the center of his aged chest, stark against the weathered skin, was a tattoo. Mercy gasped. The sound was involuntary, ripped from her throat by shock. She knew that mark. She had traced it with her fingers by the light of the fire. She had kissed that identical, jagged star on her husband's shoulder 1,000 times in the dark. For months, she had believed the story. The world told her that it was an old arrow wound, a scar of violence. But looking at the ink on the elder's chest, realizing it was a perfect mirror to the mark on Gideon's skin, the truth crashed into her. It wasn't a wound. It wasn't a scar. It was a birthmark. It was a crest. It was a map leading home. The chief leaned closer. Invading the space Gideon, usually guarded with iron and instinct. He whispered, "It wasn't English. It wasn't the rough slang of the mining camps. It was a language of wind and stone. A tongue as old as the mountains themselves." Mercy didn't understand the words, but she felt their weight settle over the clearing. Gideon turned back to Mercy. The bullet in his leg was burning, but the pain in his eyes, that was worse. He looked at the dark timber where the mercenaries had vanished. He knew the truth. They were just the vanguard. If he stayed, the army would follow. If he stayed, the war would come to this doorstep. And his wife, and the unborn child she carried, would be the casualties. But if he went, if he reclaimed the power offered by the old man, they might just survive. He reached out, placing his hand stained with the blood of the fight and the dirt of the struggle gently onto the warmth of her pregnant belly. "I must go," he rasped, the words tearing at his throat. "To end this. To create a world safe enough for our child. I swear to you, Mercy, on this bloodline, I will return before our child's first cry is heard." He didn't look back again. He mounted a spare horse brought forward by a warrior and rode alongside the chieftain. He was no longer just a wanderer, a marshal, or a fugitive. In that moment, riding into the shadows, he looked like a king returning to battle. And then, the deep forest swallowed them whole. Mercy stood alone in the vast silence of the spirit lands. She didn't chase him. She didn't weep. She placed one hand on her stomach. Her chin lifted high against the coming night. The fortress she had built was no longer a cabin of timber and stone. It was her. She was alone again on the ridge. But she was not empty. She carried a life. And she carried a promise. But who is Gideon? Truly, what did the old chieftain whisper that could make a man leave the woman he loved more than his own breath? Winter tests the roots. Spring brings the bloom. But summer brings the fire. Tell me, my friends, do you think Gideon is just a sheriff? Or is he something far more dangerous? What does that star really mean? I want to read your theories in the comments below. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? It always warms my spirit to see how far these trails reach across the world. If this story moved you, please give the video a like. It truly helps the campfire burn a little brighter. And share it with a friend who appreciates the spirit of the West. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Eagle Eye Apache and ring that bell so you never miss the next chapter. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon. Stay safe out there.